The record that should not exist, August 1834, Briarstead Parish, Virginia. They said the fog rolled in from the river that morning, thick, white, and low, as if the ground itself exhaled. By noon it clung to the trees, and the air inside the house tasted like old linen and iron. That was the day the first mention of Eleanor Gray appeared in the parish records, written in the same precise hand that catalogued livestock, crop yields, and deaths. No birth date, no parentage, just a single entry, female, age uncertain, acquired by Dr. W. H. Gray for domestic service. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. Dr. Wilfred Harlan Gray was a physician of reputable lineage and quiet ambition. His estate, Briarstead, stood on the edge of the James River Valley, its whitewashed columns already yellowing from humidity and neglect. The house had been built for his father, but it was Eleanor who would come to define it. No portrait of her exists, but neighbors described her as unnaturally tall, her features refined yet strange, like something drawn from memory rather than born. One wrote decades later. The first reports of her strength came from the servants who worked beneath the kitchen. They spoke of a woman who could lift barrels of cornmeal single-handedly, who never seemed to tire, who healed from cuts and burns faster than anyone they had ever known. Yet she rarely spoke. Weeks passed without so much as a word from her. When she did speak, it was said her voice carried an echo, as though another voice whispered just behind it. By 1835, Eleanor had been moved from the main house to a small cottage on the east edge of the property, ostensibly to care for the Gray children. But Wilfred's wife, Agatha, wrote in her diary of strange noises that came from that side of the estate, rhythmic scraping like metal against stone, and the sound of someone praying in a language she could not place. Agatha's entries grow fragmented after that. Her handwriting, once elegant, became jagged, letters looping over one another. He calls her a subject, not a servant. I hear them at night. The cellar door is never locked any more. When Agatha fell ill in the spring of 1836, Wilfred claimed it was fever. The parish nurse said otherwise. She found the woman's arms covered in pale scars arranged like deliberate patterns, rings, dots, and symmetrical lines burned into the skin. There were rumors of experiments, whispered by the few servants who dared remain at Briarstead, rumors that Eleanor was not merely a woman, but a study, part of Gray's growing obsession with hereditary refinement, as he called it in his medical notebooks. Those notebooks have never been recovered in full. Only fragments survive, found in a charred box after the war. The pages that remain contain sketches of bones, diagrams of faces, and notations like specimen e.g., remarkable regenerative capacity, requires isolation. Local records indicate Eleanor vanished in the winter of 1837, the same night the east cottage burned to the ground. Dr. Gray claimed she had fled north, taking with her several items of his property. But 3 men from the neighboring farm later testified that they saw something moving along the riverbank that night. Something large, walking slowly into the water while holding what looked like a bundle of cloth against its chest. By morning, only the charred remains of the cottage and a single iron shackle were found in the ash. No one in Briarstead ever saw Eleanor Gray again. The first formal record following Eleanor's disappearance came 7 years later, in 1844, when Thomas Gray, Wilfred's eldest surviving son, took possession of Briarstead after his father's death. The estate inventory listed medical instruments, 1 incomplete anatomical manuscript, and 9 portraits of unknown women. And none of these paintings were ever identified. All bore the same strange signature on the back, a looping mark that resembled 2 mirrored crescents joined at their tips. Thomas's early letters reveal a man uncertain about his inheritance. He wrote to his cousin in Richmond, The east field yields nothing, the soil refuses every seed, the servants speak of sounds under the earth, voices that travel through the floorboards when the moon is high. His correspondence was steady at first, then abruptly ceased in the winter of 1845. That same winter, the county registrar noted the burial of 3 stillborn infants on the property, entries signed not by Thomas, but by the house steward, a man named Elias Morrow. When questioned later, Morrow claimed the records were in error, that there had been only 1 burial, yet his voice faltered when asked whose children they had been. Visitors to Briarstead during that time remarked on the house's odd atmosphere. Though the family had once entertained frequently, the new master kept to himself. The windows on the east side remained shuttered at all hours, and a faint chemical odor, acrid and metallic, hung constantly in the halls. A traveling clergyman later recalled that when he dined there, he heard a muffled thumping from beneath the floor, as if something vast was breathing, slow and deep. In the attic, Thomas had gathered what survived of his father's research. The surviving notes show attempts to replicate what Wilfrid had called the Eleanor anomaly. The younger Gray's handwriting, neat at first, grows frantic by mid-year. One line reads simply, "It does not die when drowned." By 1846, 2 servants vanished without record. The neighbors assumed they had fled north, but their belongings remained in their quarters untouched. Around the same time, Thomas began employing laborers from distant counties, men unfamiliar with Briarstead's reputation. None stayed longer than a month. A fragment of Thomas's journal was later found inside the binding of a family Bible recovered from the ruins of the property in the 1920s. The page, brittle with age, contains only a few legible sentences. She comes in dreams, face pale as ash, hands dripping river water. I hear her whisper to the children through the walls. They answer in unison, the same word again and again remember. Local rumor claimed that Eleanor's descendants, if any survived, bore a resemblance too precise to be coincidence. A girl born in Briarstead parish in 1847 was described in a midwife's report as uncommonly tall for a newborn. When the midwife asked about the father, the mother refused to speak. Her silence, according to later family accounts, was absolute, like a vow, they said. By the close of 1847, Thomas Gray's name vanished from all surviving parish ledgers. The property taxes for Briarstead went unpaid for 3 years. When an inspector finally visited, he found the manor locked and overgrown, dust thick on every surface except the cellar door, which showed signs of recent use. He did not open it. The inspector's written statement ends with a single line, "There was breathing inside." When the estate was finally seized by the county in 1849, officials catalogued what remained inside Briarstead. Among rotted furniture and blackened plaster, they discovered a locked cabinet within the eastern study. The key was never found, but the hinges were pried open with a crowbar. Inside lay several notebooks wrapped in oilskin, their pages warped from moisture, yet meticulously dated between 1838 and 1847. These journals, now referred to as the Gray Anatomical Ledger, are written mostly in Wilfrid Gray's hand, though a different script, telegant, almost feminine, appears in the margins. The first entries describe routine experiments in tissue animation. A grotesque continuation of the phrenological studies Wilfrid had once presented in London, but later pages darken. The language turns clinical, detached, and nearly reverent when mentioning Eleanor, subject E. He writes, demonstrates resistance to decay post-mortem. Blood clots fail to form as expected. The eyes retain vitreous clarity after 20 hours submerged. Some pages include diagrams, rudimentary but deliberate. depicting elongated limbs, abnormal vertebral structures, and a featureless face labeled only as transitory state. Beside one drawing, a note in the second hand reads, "She begged him to stop." In a separate volume, the tone shifts again. Wilfrid refers to the offspring, describing a series of deliveries that resulted in neither life nor death, but endurance. He writes of hiding them in the old springhouse, where the air stays cold and the light never reaches. Elias Morau, the steward who once recorded the false burials, later confessed under questioning that he had carried bundles from the house to the springhouse at night. He insisted he never saw what was inside, though he claimed they moved of their own accord. The ledger closes abruptly with an undated fragment. I have watched the flesh learn memory. Her form repeats itself in ways I cannot measure. What was curse becomes design. Perhaps God erred first. After the discovery, the notebooks were quietly sealed in the county archive, but a local physician, Dr. Henry Colling, made transcriptions before their confiscation. His copy, found in his estate decades later, includes annotations suggesting he attempted to replicate the experiments. In the margins, he sketches a fetus with 2 spines and writes, "If this is inheritance, then humanity itself is a contagion." A faint rumor spread that Dr. Colling began hearing weeping from within his walls after studying the notes. His servants left soon after. He was found dead in his library that winter, his mouth filled with Black River silt. The ledgers were never recovered from the county vault. In 1912, a flood destroyed the archive, but locals insist that certain items were already missing before the water came. Among them, the sealed cabinet labeled G47. For generations afterward, those who lived near the Briarstead ruins spoke of pale shapes seen near the springhouse, especially when fog rose from the low fields. They said the figures did not walk so much as fold across the ground, moving with impossible grace, as if remembering a body they once had. When interviewed in 1923, one elderly woman, whose grandmother had been a servant at Briarstead, whispered to the historian, "The river kept her, but she learned how to crawl back out." The ruins of Briarstead remained untouched for nearly 80 years, swallowed by ivy and silence. In 1928, during the brief restoration attempt funded by the Historical Preservation Society of Virginia, workers began clearing the land east of the manor. It was there they uncovered the springhouse, a low, stone structure sunk into the earth, half collapsed but still cold inside, even under the summer sun. The foreman's journal, later recovered from his granddaughter's attic, described the first descent. "The air was wet, like the breath of something sleeping," he wrote. "We broke through the door and found a staircase leading down, though no one recalled there being a cellar on the plans. At the bottom lay a narrow chamber lined with wooden troughs, each fitted with rusted metal restraints. The walls bore initials carved into the mortar, E.G., W.G., T.G., and dozens of unrecognizable marks resembling ribs or wings. The men found fragments of preserved tissue floating in stagnant water, the consistency of wax. One piece, roughly the size of a child's hand, was described as soft but pulsing, as if remembering heat. That evening, the crew refused to return. Only the foreman and a single assistant went back to document the site. Their photographs were confiscated shortly after, reportedly due to damage of negatives, though the assistant later claimed the images had come out perfectly clear, too clear. He described one photograph showing a figure kneeling by the far wall, though neither of them recalled seeing anyone there. A few weeks later, the foreman disappeared. His coat was found draped over a fence post near the river. Inside one pocket was a note scrawled in pencil. "She's still down there. She never stopped whispering." The Historical Society quietly halted all restoration efforts. Local papers printed a single article calling the discovery an unfortunate accident during excavation. and no official follow-up was ever published. However, in 1931, a graduate student from the University of Richmond, Miriam Delaney, returned to study the Briarstead materials for her thesis on antebellum medical practices. Her surviving notes reference a series of preserved organs kept in a state of unnatural animation, though she admits the jars had been missing since the county seizure of 1849. The final page of her research log ends mid-sentence. The samples possess a pattern akin to human gestation but incomplete, something between inheritance and imitation. The tissue, she vanished 2 weeks later. The university denied her association, and her dormitory trunk was emptied before her parents arrived. After that, the Gray property was abandoned entirely. Locals began avoiding the area, claiming to hear faint singing when passing by at dusk, an uneven, mournful hum that seemed to rise from beneath the earth. Children who wandered too close spoke of seeing a pale woman kneeling beside the spring, her hair drifting as if underwater, her eyes reflecting candlelight though no flame was there. By 1934, a levee project buried most of Briarstead under redirected river silt. Yet each spring, when the floodwaters recede, a circular patch of earth above the old springhouse remains untouched. Dark, damp, and breathing steam, in local folklore they still call that place Gray's Mouth. Few go near it. Fewer speak of what happens when the mist rolls in and the soil begins to tremble, as though something beneath remembers the sound of its own name. In the winter of 1937, a series of letters surfaced among the papers of Dr. Henry Colling, the physician who had transcribed portions of the Gray anatomical ledger before his death. These documents, later nicknamed the Colling transcripts, were addressed to an unnamed correspondent, likely another academic, and dated between 1909 and 1911, decades before his demise. The tone of the letters begins scholarly but descends steadily into obsession. Colling writes of genetic mimicry, long before the concept existed in formal biology, insisting that the Grays discovered the body's ability to recall its former states, as a phonograph recalls music. He claims that what Wilfred Gray achieved was not resurrection, but repetition, that Eleanor's cells learned to reproduce her image imperfectly across generations. Every drop of blood retains an echo, he wrote. If taught properly, it will speak her shape again. Attached to one of the letters is a hand, drawn diagram showing an umbilical cord spliced to a glass tube, labeled transmission conduit. Beneath it, a note in shaky script reads, "She bore him 13 times, though she died only once." By 1910, Colling's writing fractures. He describes hearing a wet ticking from his specimen jars at night. His final letter, smudged and nearly illegible, claims that one jar had refilled itself, though he had emptied it days prior. He ends with, "I hear her humming through the fluid now, a tune without mercy." The correspondence was eventually donated to the Ashwell Medical Library, where it remained sealed for decades. In 1938, following renewed interest in the Gray estate, a researcher named Dr. Frederick Lyle requested access to the transcripts. Within months, he resigned from his post, citing ill health and persistent night disturbances. His wife later told a neighbor that he had begun keeping buckets of salt water under the bed to muffle the sounds from beneath. One page of his personal journal, preserved in the library's restricted archive, details what he saw during his study. The ink bleeds in circles when left open overnight. The letters form the shape of an eye. I believe it watches to see if I still remember her name. By then, the story of Eleanor Gray had faded from public record, surviving only as rural legend. But in academic circles, whispers persisted, rumors of tissue samples still circulating among collectors of medical curiosities. In 1940, a specimen labeled EG-13 was sold anonymously to a private anatomy museum in Baltimore. When curators attempted to preserve it in formaldehyde, the fluid turned black within hours. Visitors to that museum later reported hearing a faint humming in the exhibit hall, low, feminine, and continuous. Though no sound equipment was present, the jar was quietly removed and never displayed again. Today, the calling transcripts remain largely unread. The library catalog lists them as in restoration. The box, however, is missing. Archivists insist it was misplaced during renovation in the 1970s. Yet, every few years, a new librarian swears to have seen it briefly, on a different shelf, always misfiled, always damp to the touch, as though freshly retrieved from water. The rumor persists that the papers themselves are growing softer, their fibers turning almost skin-like. Those who have handled them describe a strange warmth, a faint pulse, and a subtle rhythm, like something remembering how to breathe. In 1952, the last recorded descendant of the Gray bloodline, Margaret Linton, née Gray, filed an inheritance claim for what remained of the Briarstead property. Her claim was largely symbolic. The land had long been absorbed by the state, and no structures stood above ground. Still, her affidavit, it contains a peculiar addendum, a request for retrieval of personal items belonging to the maternal archive. No such archive was listed in county records. Margaret's correspondence, preserved in the Richmond Historical Society, reveals her growing unease with the family's buried past. In one letter to a university historian, she wrote, "I have found the river again. It runs differently now, slower, but I can hear her in it. She never forgave us for sealing her name in glass." Later letters take a more desperate tone. She describes a recurring dream of standing at the mouth of a tunnel, wet stone, flickering lanterns, a hum rising through her spine. She claims to see a figure kneeling by the water, not frightening at first, but familiar. It was not death that took her, Margaret wrote, but memory itself, fed until it became hunger. In October of that same year, Margaret traveled alone to the ruins. Locals saw her near the levee, wearing a black shawl and carrying a small wooden box. She was never seen again. 2 days later, children found her automobile half-submerged in the riverbank mud, its engine still warm. Inside the car was a single item, a damp envelope addressed to the custodian of records, Briarstead Parish, though the parish had been dissolved for nearly a century. Inside the envelope was a short note written in Margaret's hand. "I've heard her call the others. The old cells still listen." Following Margaret's disappearance, rumors circulated of excavation noises at the Briarstead site late at night, metal striking stone, muffled voices, the rhythmic scrape of shovels. A state inspector sent to investigate found no workers, but described the ground as soft and swollen, as though it had been freshly turned. His report ends with a curious detail. "When I pressed my ear to the soil, I could hear faint tapping from beneath, steady and patient. I could not say how deep." Weeks later, an unmarked parcel arrived at the Richmond Historical Society. Inside was Margaret's wooden box, bone, dry despite recent rains. It contained a small glass vial sealed with wax. The label read, "E.G. Fragment 14. When the curator attempted to open it, the wax cracked, but the glass did not. The curator described feeling a brief warmth in his palm, as if something inside had shifted closer. The vial was later stored in a temperature-controlled case, though the humidity inside continues to rise without any apparent leak. Decades later, when the case was re-examined in 1971, the fragment was gone. The glass remained sealed, but the interior appeared empty, except for a faint condensation forming in the shape of a human fingerprint. Some claim that on humid nights, the case fogs completely over, and from behind the mist, a faint outline appears, something long, limbed, kneeling, its head bowed toward the river's direction. The staff call it the listener. By 1974, the legend of Eleanor Gray had become little more than a local ghost story told in schoolyards and campgrounds along the James. Teenagers dared each other to visit the Briarstead ruins after dark, to walk down to the muddy river's edge and call her name 3 times. Most only heard frogs and the slow churn of water, but sometimes the brave ones swore they heard knocking from below, dull and deliberate, as though the ground itself was answering back. That year, a small archaeological team from the University of Virginia received a grant to conduct an official excavation at the Briarstead site, led by Dr. Alan Cresswell, a specialist in antebellum architecture. The team's goal was to locate the original foundations of the plantation and map its subsurface tunnels. They began in August during an unusually dry season when the James River had receded enough to expose a wide sandbar, the same one described in Margaret Linton's final letters. The team unearthed stone remnants of the main house and several outbuildings, but what caught their attention was a series of perfectly circular depressions running in a straight line toward the river. Beneath the third depression, they found a narrow shaft lined with old oak planks, waterlogged but intact. Inside lay fragments of iron, rusted lengths of chain, fused together with time. On the third night of the dig, graduate assistant Ellen Moore reported hearing metal scraping from the shaft. Long after the others had gone to sleep, when she leaned over the opening with her flashlight, the beam caught movement, a ripple deep below, followed by what she described as a handprint rising in the water, palm up, as though pressed from beneath. The next morning, the shaft was half filled with river water. None of the others believed her. Cresswell insisted it was groundwater seeping through from the riverbed, but Ellen refused to go near the shaft again. 2 days later, their instruments began malfunctioning. Compasses spun wildly. The air near the excavation site registered a consistent drop in temperature, even under the noon sun. The team noted that animals, stray dogs, birds, even insects, avoided the dig perimeter entirely. On September 3rd, while clearing debris from the lowest tunnel entrance, one worker struck something hard that gave off a hollow sound. Beneath a layer of compacted earth lay a sealed glass cylinder, identical in size to the vial recovered from Margaret's car 20 years earlier. This one bore no label. Inside the cylinder was a small square of folded cloth, and when opened under controlled conditions, the fabric revealed a hand, stitched marking 9 vertical lines, each one crossed by a single horizontal slash. Beneath them, faintly visible in reddish ink, was a phrase in archaic script, "They listen in the water." That night, Ellen Moore left her tent and walked barefoot to the river's edge. Her journal, recovered the next morning, lay open on a stone. The final entry read, "She isn't gone. The river is her mouth. Every summer it speaks again." Ellen's body was never found. Her flashlight was discovered submerged just beneath the sandbar, still flickering weakly. The excavation was halted immediately, and all findings were sealed by state order pending safety review. But the locals say that in late August, when the water runs low and the moon sits red above the pines, you can still see faint light moving beneath the surface, like the reflection of a lantern swaying from a chain, and if you listen closely enough, you can hear a woman's voice whisper from below. Current counting 1 through 9. After the disappearance of Ellen Moore, the state's official position was silence. The University of Virginia withdrew its sponsorship, funding dried up. Dr. Cresswell left academia altogether and moved west. But the records, maps, sketches, and transcriptions from those brief weeks remained locked away in the university's archives until 1987, when graduate historian Daniel Whitlock requested access for his thesis on anomalous excavations of the Reconstruction era. Whitlock was a quiet man, meticulous and skeptical by nature. He was not hunting ghosts. He wanted dates, oil composition, flood records, architectural notes. But what he found inside the file marked Briarstead, Site C, unsettled him. Along with the excavation, logs were audio tapes, unmarked except for a single word scrawled on the case in faded pencil: listening. There were 9 recordings in total. Each began with the ambient noise of the river, frogs, wind, distant traffic. Then faintly the sound of knocking, rhythmic, deliberate, like metal striking stone underwater. On the final tape, recorded just 2 nights before Ellen vanished, a woman's voice can be heard counting softly: 5, 6, 7. The voice was low, distorted, and echoing, as though recorded through a thick wall of water. Whitlock assumed it was a hoax, perhaps fabricated by one of the graduate students to add drama to their research. But when he attempted to match the voice to anyone in the excavation roster, none of the recordings aligned with known vocal profiles. The timbre was older, deeper, like a singer who'd once shouted for years and lost the melody. Still, he pressed on. Using the excavation maps, Whitlock returned to the site himself. He expected to find nothing, just overgrown ruins and mud. But the moment he stepped onto the low ground near the river, his compass needle spun violently. His tape recorder failed. The air felt dense, oppressive. That night, in his motel, Whitlock transcribed notes with shaking hands. He wrote, "The ground hums, not noise, vibration. It feels like breath moving through soil. I think she's still beneath it." He returned twice more over the following week, each time documenting subtle changes. Stones rearranged into 9 small piles by morning, footprints in the damp earth, though he'd been alone. On his 3rd and final visit, Whitlock brought an assistant, Julia Mayfield, to document the foundation remains. While photographing the exposed tunnel entrance, Julia noticed something glinting between the collapsed bricks. A glass lens, perfectly circular, embedded as though fused into the mortar itself. When held to the light, it revealed an inscription barely visible around the rim: "Property of Dr. L. Thorne, 1846. This was the name of the plantation's original physician, the man who'd assisted Eleanor Gray's captor in his experiments, and whose records had vanished after 1850. Whitlock sent the artifact to the university lab for analysis. Before results could return, he disappeared. Julia filed a missing persons report, but all police found at the site was his notebook, open and soaked through from rain. The final entry, dated October 12, 1987, read, "I understand now. It wasn't about bloodlines. It was about continuance. The river keeps what we bury in it." The following spring, after heavy flooding, the sandbar where the excavations had been conducted was gone, washed away completely. When the water receded, new piles of stones appeared farther downstream, 9 of them again, perfectly arranged as if carried and placed by unseen hands. Locals began calling that stretch of river Gray's Mouth. Fishermen avoided it. Children were warned not to swim there, and sometimes, when storms passed, residents along the river swore the walls of their houses vibrated softly, like an unseen current moving through the foundation itself. By 1992, the story of Eleanor Gray had receded once again into rumor. The old locals spoke of Gray's Mouth as if it were cursed, an invisible boundary along the James where boats stalled, fish died, and the air carried a faint, metallic taste. But among the younger generation, the legend had mutated into something new. College students from Richmond and Charlottesville came on dares, filming themselves near the riverbank, whispering her name for cheap thrills. Most left laughing. A few did not return. That spring, a film student named Marla Dennett chose the Briarstead legend as her final project, a short documentary on folk hauntings of the Reconstruction South. She interviewed descendants of the Thorne family, former locals, and even one surviving member of the 1974 dig crew, an elderly man named Calvin Rhodes, now institutionalized at a care facility outside Petersburg. Calvin was frail, nearly blind, but when Marla mentioned the name Elinor Gray, his hands began to tremble. She wasn't a ghost, he whispered. She was waiting. The river's just her skin now. Marla pressed for details, but Calvin refused to say more. He began to weep, muttering, "She took the one who listened. She takes one every generation." Undeterred, Marla and her small crew traveled to the river to film. The area was overgrown, reclaimed by pine and reed. Near dusk, they found what they assumed to be remnants of a retaining wall, stone fragments in a rough crescent shape. Beneath one, Marla discovered a smooth slate plaque covered in faint carvings. When dusted and photographed, the markings formed a pattern, 9 vertical lines crossed by one horizontal stroke. The others laughed it off, calling it graffiti, but Marla recognized it from her research. The symbol recovered in 1974. That night, she recorded a voiceover for her documentary Beside the Water, speaking about Elinor's disappearance, her daughters, and the lingering folklore. Playback of the footage later revealed that during her narration, a second voice whispered intermittently beneath her own, a low, measured cadence, repeating her words seconds after she spoke them, like an echo delayed through liquid. The next morning, the crew found the camera still recording, pointed toward the river. The sandbar had shifted again, forming a shallow depression shaped eerily like a footprint. Marla was gone. Her shoes remained near the edge, her bag half buried in silt. 2 days later, local fishermen discovered a body downstream, lodged between branches. It was female, early 20s, her face pale but peaceful, yet the coroner's report noted something inexplicable. Her lungs were completely dry, despite being pulled from the river. The body bore faint markings on the arms, a series of small, parallel scratches, 9 on each forearm. The documentary footage recovered from her camera was released posthumously in edited form. In the final uncut sequence, Marla appears briefly in frame, looking past the lens towards something unseen. She smiles faintly and whispers she's not angry anymore. She just wants them remembered. Then the tape distort, static, flickering light, and a sudden rush of water filling the frame. For a split second before the footage ends, a reflection is visible behind Marla, the faint outline of a tall woman standing waist deep in the river, her head turned toward the camera, her eyes open and unblinking. When the documentary aired on public access television that October, the broadcast cut out in several counties along the James at the exact same timestamp, 47:06. Later, technicians confirmed no technical fault. Since then, locals claim that every 19 years the river draws someone back, not by choice but by recognition, as though Elinor Gray's line still lives searching, calling home the ones who remember her name. By 2011, the last of the Briarstead estate had collapsed under its own weight. The roof caved inward, the floorboards blackened from rot and weather. Locals said the place breathed when the wind blew from the east. Timbers groaning, air sighing through the hollow chimney like lungs filling with mud. No one lived near the water anymore. Yet records show that a small academic team from the University of Virginia arrived that March to catalog remaining artifacts before the property was cleared. Among them was Professor Daniel Cormack, an anthropologist who specialized in postbellum folklore. He was known for his skepticism, but his journal, later recovered from the site, reads like the confession of a man slowly losing faith in reason. March 18, 2011, the house resists documentation. The instruments fail near the southern rooms. Compass needles spin. There is a residue on the floorboards, black but not organic, like iron dust mixed with oil. The men refuse to enter after sundown. I hear something at night. Water moving under the foundation, though the ground here is dry. Asterisk March 21st, we found the nursery. A narrow room behind the second parlor, concealed by plaster, 9 small cribs, all empty, but each bearing initials carved into the rail. They match the old thorn register. I feel watched, though the windows are sealed. Asterisk March 23rd, the well out back has filled again. The foreman said it was bone dry yesterday. I dropped a light inside. The reflection showed a woman's face, mine at first glance. But when I looked closer, her eyes did not move with mine. They were fixed upward, as if waiting for someone to lean in. Asterisk, that was his final entry. The rest was pieced together from field notes and voicemail transcripts sent to his assistant the night before his disappearance. In the last recording, Cormac whispers, "It's not water, it's breath. It's her, and she remembers every name we gave her." The excavation was halted 2 days later after a student vanished from the site. Only her equipment remained, a camera submerged in shallow mud. The footage, once restored, showed the faint reflection of 9 silhouettes standing in the reeds, their forms trembling as though beneath a running current. After the incident, the state ordered the property fenced off and reclassified as a protected wetland. The river slowly consumed what remained. Today, only the foundation stones of Briarstead lie visible during drought, arranged in the same crescent shape that once bordered Elinor's garden. Locals say that on certain nights, when the fog sits low on the James, the air thickens with the scent of lilac and wet wood. Some claim to hear lullabies carried over the water, soft, rhythmic, sung in a voice that does not belong to this century. The few who have dared to listen closely report that the song has no melody, only a pattern of breathing in and out, steady as tide. They say if you speak her name aloud by the water, the sound comes back slower. It echoes, not in air, but from below, as if something patient and ancient is repeating it back, testing the syllables, remembering. The historians who studied the Briarstead papers noted one final oddity. Every generation since 1834 has produced 9 daughters somewhere along the old Thorn bloodline. None live past 35. The last known descendant was born in 1992, the same year Marla Dennett disappeared. Her name was Elinor, though her family swore they'd chosen it at random. If you ever find yourself near the James at dusk, listen before you speak. The river does not forget, and it does not give back what it keeps. She never drowned, she adapted.